first of the autumn by 3 poets published by Bloodaxe. Tonight we have Stephanie Norgate and Hannah Lowe live, and we have an audio visual presentation of Selima Hill. We've got 2 poets publishing their 3rd collections, and we have Selima Hill publishing her 20th collection. Poems about friendships, growing up, poems about men, relationships between women and men, between teachers and those they teach, poems about grief. We also have one collection entirely made up of sonnets and another of 7 sequences of very short poems. Thanks to the Poetry Society and Emily Berry, the contribution by Selima Hill takes the form of audio from a podcast which she did with the Poetry Society, excerpts from that audio, with her reading some of the poems from her new book, Men Who Feed Pigeons, and excerpts from the interview with Emily. And at the end of the event, we'll be having a discussion between Stephanie and Hannah, in which they'll be talking about their books and also talking about their response to Selima's book also. So the first poet who's going to read tonight is going to be Stephanie Norgate. This is her 3rd collection, The Conversation. Like Hannah Lowe, her 1st collection was shortlisted for the Ford Prize for Best First Collection. This 3rd collection of hers explores relationships between nature and the city, between the past and present, character and writer. And there are poems about friendship and also grief. And Stephanie this evening is in Midhurst in Sussex. So we'll have a short, sorry, I should have said that the poets are going to read 2 sets. So we're going to have Stephanie first, then Hannah, and then Selima, and then the same again. So would you please welcome Stephanie Norgate?
Hi, thanks for coming. The first poem in the book is called The House, and I guess it's a pretty common experience to walk the streets of a town or village that's new to you and see lit up windows and wish that you could go inside or know the people, a kind of desire for connection, a melancholy but slightly delightful feeling, which I wanted to conjure through this sort of magical house, the house. Don't tell me that you've never lingered under the eaves of the mystery house, wondering who lives there, conjuring their lives. Don't tell me the house has never appeared to you in the town street or along a woodland lane, where its windows throw out long squares of light. It must be a cold night after a short day, salt and grit glinting on pavements, ice thickening on potholes. You will feel a little lonely between the now and the then, with the old life heard away in the hills, a faint singing of owls. Then the house will appear grown in the gap, hiding its gold behind gauze or linen, until a figure opens the curtains, sees you standing there. If you're brave, you'll step onto the night path, leave your prints on thin snow, and climb the steps to the porch. At your knock, the door will open to a room of talk, where last year's logs hiss and silver in the blackening stove. The old friends will be there, saying, "You're late, we waited. Where were you?" The next poem I'm going to read is the title poem of the book, The Conversation, and it's dedicated to the memory of Helen Dunmore, who was a very close friend of mine. Before Helen had a diagnosis of cancer a few months before, we spent a day in the Costa Cafe in Trafalgar Square. We went to arrive for coffee, we stayed for lunch, we carried on and we had tea, and our conversation lasted the whole day. Because Helen was such a brilliant poet, I wanted to record that special time as if poetry forms themselves were a form of time, which of course they are with the rhythmic beat of poetry, and each poem contains time really. So I wanted to celebrate that day, and of course I was prompted to write it a few months later when we found out about her illness. The conversation. Now our words need a new measure of time, syllables for seconds, sonnets for minutes, epics for hours. This is our cafe society, as if the cafe will never close and the steps from the cafe will never tip us out onto Trafalgar Square to hurry across the wet stones with the gold of our talk glinting round our feet, the largesse of winter scattering our reflections into the tears of the fountain's mist, which falls and rises to the lit-up windows, gathering in the bare-armed trees. There we are, leaving the coffee spoons and teaspoons on saucers, hurrying away to our separate evenings, walking out among the languages of the world, which find no true word for the talk of women. Unless, dear friend, I name our talk for you, a light that shimmers along city streets and out along the lanes of great-souled hills. Actually, as in a gazelle, I coded in the meaning of Helen's name to the end of the poem. I looked up words for the talk of women, and they're all horrible, like gossip and backstabbing and so on. So I wanted, in a way, to invent something new, positive and shining out of Helen's name for the talk. And the next poem too is about my grief for Helen. Between Helen dying and the funeral, we went away for a week to Cornwall, and not to the place we usually went, but to a cove where they were doing a community play, and really strange things kept happening. And because you have magical thinking when you're in grief, it felt like Helen had provided us with the strange world of her Ingo books. Somehow strange Cornish magic, people singing amongst the fishing boats and mermaids coming in, and a giant chasing people across the cliffs. This is called The Summoner of Birds. A rounded woman, her hair up in a sea-coloured net, wearing a blue dress, a white apron, carrying a bowl on her hip, walks out of now, walks out of time, walks out onto the pebbles, steps over the winch's chain to the wash of small waves to summon a gyre of gulls and their cries. She pauses where the stream pours into the sea, lifts the bowl from her hip, and in one curved move flings knuckle bones, neck joints, spare ribs, arrows of sea bass, sole and cod into the air to drop in a moment's fall, till snatched by the beaks of the gulls and carried up again, while sandpipers pick the beach clean and the winch weighs down the scene. Then comes a winged giant along the Todden, threatening death, but underneath an actor works his wings. Mostly what I miss in these soon after days is our talk, what I would have said and what you would have made of this. The shadows of things, of gulls, of paper wings, of bones, play out on the harbour shore with one witness less. And now the woman in the blue dress picks up the empty bowl and returns to the inn. The giant folds his wings. Even with you gone, I shape this story and ask, what do you make of this? And I've got one more short one at the end of this set, which is a kind of response to a very famous poem by, I think you say, Edith Jansavaj, a Turkish poet who wrote the famous poem The Table. And his is wonderfully positive and amazing. Mine is kind of slightly more downbeat, but it's making it a feminine, a kind of a female answer to his poem. The Night Table. A woman who can't sleep puts the moon on the table in its halo of cloud. goes out to the garden to cut woodruff and jugs a sheath of its tall stems for the table. She puts the agony of doing wrong on the table. She questions the meaning of 3 and puts her question on the table. She takes a torch and puzzles out woundwort in the wilderness of the hedge. In the kitchen, lit by the moon's lamp, she counts off red flowers. Woundwort, she says, healer of cuts, mender of skin, cure me now. Even though marigolds close their faces to the dark, she pounds their orange petals with a pestle. Then she calls dawn to the table to sweep up the curled seed moons and scatter them onto a bed of earth. The woman prays for sleep and puts her prayer on the table. The table creaks. That's the end of my first set.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And if you have any comments to make or questions, do put them in the YouTube chat and they will be forwarded to us so that we can take them up at the end of the event. Second reader tonight is Hannah Lowe, and this is her 3rd collection. And she tells me that a number of the people in the picture, including her, are here tonight. So no doubt we'll hear more about that shortly. Hannah was born in Ilford. Her father was a Jamaican Chinese gambler, and her mother was an English teacher. And her first 2 collections, Chick and Chan, draw quite a lot on that particular background. The new book relates to her teaching for a decade in a London 6th form, and the whole book are sonnets. And the poems cover different timescales. There's the time that she was teaching in the 2000s. There's now the perspective of her son growing up in London, and there's the perspective from the front cover of herself growing up as a student in London. And Hannah is tonight reading to us from London. Hannah.
Hi everyone. I'm on my sofa in Wood Green, and thank you all for being here, old friends, poet friends, new friends. I'm going to read the prologue poem in the book, which is about how I became a teacher. And again, you know, I'm never far away from the story of my dad. It's about my father dying, and it kind of sent me into, you know, grief and a kind of psychic shock about trying to find meaning in life. And at that time, I was working in a very corporate company, and I used to read my boss's emails, and he actually called me the world's worst personal assistant. So it wasn't going that well. The white dog. My father was dead. I rode to work each morning through Farringdon, down Charterhouse Street, and saw the same white dog, a terrier, licking a puddle of blood leaked by the morning meat the butchers hauled across their backs to Smithfields. Dead pigs and chickens hung on silver hooks below my office. Upstairs, I typed and filed memos for Shell, BP, shareholder handbooks. But every time I saw that dog trotting with blood in its beard, its eyes gone cloudy blue, the same thought tap, tap, tapped my head, a spoon against a hard-boiled egg. All afternoon at the photocopier, typing, filing, typing. He was dead. He was dead. Now what should I do? Well, I became a teacher. And this poem is about, you know, it's just this kind of moment in time now, September, that new pencil case feeling. And my first day working at the sixth form, the register. That first September, I climbed the bluestone steps, past Shakespeare's doubtful face, an old mosaic of Jamaica, and the ruby blot of lips where last year's girls had kissed the schoolhouse brick. Now this year's crop pushed past, all clattery chat, their first day back. What's up? Salam. The Fuji's blaring from someone's phone. Ready or not, here I come, you can hide. And with that old white dog still barking softly in my head, I walked the sugar-papered hall and pushed the classroom door to find a sprawl of teenagers sat waiting, my re-sitters, all back to do what they'd already failed. I took my seat and called the register. Denise, Tyrone, Alicia, Chantel. There's several poems in the book called The Art of Teaching, which I think I've deployed ironically, as this poem may demonstrate. The Art of Teaching 2. Boredom hangs like a low cloud in the classroom. Each page we read is a step up a mountain in gluey boots. Even the clock face is pained, and yes, I'm sure now, ticking slower. If gloom has a sound, it's the voice of Leroy reading Frankenstein aloud. And if we break to talk, I know my questions are feeble sparks that won't ignite my students' barely beating hearts. There is no Volta here, no turn, just more of the same. The clouds sinking ever lower, the air damper, yet more rain, and the task is unchanging, like spending years chasing a monster you yourself created. Leroy asks if he can stop reading. I say, for now, he can. So, as Neil mentioned, the book is a book of sonnets. And I guess, I chose the sonnet form initially because I love form and like the places that it pushes you to, where it pushes your imagination. But also, I guess, sonnets were the things that I was often teaching to students and trying to, kind of indoctrinate them into the canon of English literature. And, I guess the sonnet represents, high culture and, the pinnacle of that tradition. And often the struggle in teaching was how to make these young people interested in that type of literature and that type of engagement with that reading. But I also realised after I was writing for a while that the sonnet, on the page, a little square of it, maybe looked a little bit like a classroom. And so many of these poems about classroom encounters. So I kind of ran with the spirit of the classroom size poem. The Only English Kid. When the debate got going on Englishness, I'd pity the only English kid. Poor Johnny in his spotless Reeboks and blue Fred Perry. He had a voice from history. The no miss, yes miss, no miss. All treacly cockly, rag and bone. And while the others claimed Poland, Ghana, Bulgaria, and shook off England like the wrong team's shirt, John brewed his tea exclusively on Holloway Road. So when Asif mourned the George Cross banner, swinging freely like a warning from his neighbour's roof, the subway tunnel sprayed with Muslim scum, poor John would sit there quietly, looking guilty for all the awful things he hadn't done. We'll go to another encounter with a student who, I think probably the student whom I feel liked me the least. There's 2 poems for Janine. Janine was a Monday morning queasy feeling. I was never ready for her choice of sting. The late strut in, teeth kissing, rolling eyes, my protest thwacked away like swatted flies, or else the bleat of questions, 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 her pinging hand, a jack-in-the-box, a gun she kept on firing, asking over and over why we couldn't study Harry Potter. Or worse, the searing telescopic stare I winced in as she coiled a lock of hair around the middle finger shone at me. And this went on for months until somebody said the thing and finally brought ease. My dad was half Jamaican, half Chinese. My dad was half Jamaican, half Chinese. Her question at my office door, her face gone softer, searching mine for vestiges of blackness, as though she'd find a sign, a trace, the more she sought. And when I told her yes, was some fire put out? It's hard to know what heat, to presume a heat at all, or guess the stakes when teachers rarely look like those they teach. The whiteness of my skin has been confusion, chaos, agency. Janine was nicer after. Or what's up, miss? And hey, like neither me nor her remembered Monday's knackering spun out war. She'd dropped her gun. I'd somehow been excused. I'd been forgiven. And I'll finish this set with a poem. And I'm sure you at home know that the Restoration diarist Samuel Pepys, his name is pronounced Pepys, but is not spelt Pepys. I did not know that when I was teaching about Samuel Pepys. And one of those moments where you just get caught out. Pepys. The posh girls came and took a corner table, all lip gloss and ribbony hair, each with a fan of starry GCSEs and a summer of youth hostels in Europe behind them, and the future wide open to them like a rainbow parasol, or so I thought. It was Restoration comedies, and I was reading the class an essay, and though I'd seen his name, I'd never heard it. Pepys, I said it, Pepys, over and over, until one girl spoke up. Do you mean Pepys? She said, her voice pulled taut as a noose, as if I were the girl and she the teacher. And what could I have said? I read on, Pepys, 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 cool as the trickster, ridiculous as the fool.
Thank you, Hannah. And we'll be hearing from Hannah and Stephanie again shortly. But before that, we're going to hear from Selima Hill, not actually live. I've been editing Selima's work for 30 years now. I've edited 18 of her books, 18 of her 20 books, and the new book that we're publishing now, Men Who Feed Pigeons, is her 20th collection. She's someone who lives without anything involving technology apart from a telephone, not a mobile phone. She writes everything. She has masses and masses of notebooks. Very prolific. She doesn't even have a typewriter. So initially what she used to do was she went to a typist in the town where she lives and told the typist that she had some poems by a student that she taught that she needed typing up, and the typist typed them up, and then Selima posted them to me. And then 20 odd years ago, we moved forward, and she found a typist who had a computer and who typed the poems on the computer, and I was sent Word files. Selima doesn't do readings anymore. She recently had, well, a few years back, she had a diagnosis of Asperger's, which she'll talk about in the interview. And that made her, sort of gave her permission that she didn't have to give readings anymore, which she positively hates. And they make us feel very uncomfortable. Equally, she really hates the work that she's written. And she says, do you really want to publish it? And I say, yes, yes, yes. And so I have to lean on her, and eventually the book is published. All the recent books are collections of sequences. The latest one has 7 sequences in it. And because she writes sometimes 10 to 20 sequences in the course of a year, what we do is we try and hone them down to groups of sequences that work together thematically. So the new book is about men and men's relationship and women's relationships with men. And the next one will be about women. That's going to follow the year after next. Now, she agreed to do an interview with Emily Berry for the Poetry Review, which she thought was an interview by telephone, which Emily was going to transcribe, and then that would be published. But in fact, it was a podcast. So there's a recording of it, which the Poetry Society published, and they very kindly agreed to let us take some excerpts from it. So what we've done for this event is we've taken 2 chunks from that podcast in which she reads selections of poems which were published in Poetry Review, which are in the new book. And in the first one, she's reading 3 poems from The Beautiful Man with the Unpronounceable Name, one of the sequences, which is about someone else's husband. And she reads 2 poems from another sequence called Billy, about friendship between a man and a woman. And so we'll be showing those on screen as she's reading them, and then you'll see pictures of Selima and her books while she's doing the interview excerpts that we have between her and Emily Berry. So thank you again, Emily Berry and the Poetry Society. Thank you, Selima. and will now, through the wonders of modern technology, be able to hear and see Selima reading and talking about the book.
The title is about, do you know the film Closely Observed Trains? Well, the text of that is by someone called, I don't know how to pronounce it, Bohumil Harau, Hrabal. He's a writer who I love, and he fell to his death from a hotel balcony while apparently feeding the pigeons. And they always say that phrase, apparently. I always think that's interesting and sad. So always says he fell to his death while apparently feeding the pigeons. And the books are called Closely Observed Trains and also Dancing Lessons for the Advanced in Age. And I Serve the King of England. And I really like them. So it was because it seemed so touching that a man should fall from his death while feeding pigeons, which I do a lot of. So that's why it's called that. But my next book that I'm working on has got the working title, Men Who Wear Shorts. So I'm in a bit of a muddle.
You could do a whole series of men who do this or that.
But the whole point of it was that I'm trying to avoid the word men in titles.
There's no escaping them, unfortunately.
Anyway, I'm really scared you're going to ask me about feminism. But in the meantime, did you want me to just crack on and read?
Yeah, just maybe read down to and including bucket, please.
And including bucket, please. Okay. It's your bucket list, ha. Okay. Standing on his doorstep, the goose with yellow legs like yellow egg yolks, standing on his doorstep. Only me, dreaming I'm a goose, because a goose hasn't got a clue what it's doing. The beautiful man whose name I can't pronounce. I can, but it's so beautiful I don't. I prefer to think it's unpronounceable, to go to bed and think of him as fruit, glimpsed at night by someone who is lost, who walks for many days, weighed down by maps and dictionaries and old pronunciation guides until she's so exhausted and confused she can't pronounce the name of where she's going to, never mind the name of the fruit, into whose fat cheeks she dreams she's biting. A happy-looking man. A happy-looking man for a change. And that's what's made me come here in the first place. I'm fed up with the men in my life who seem to think happiness is irrelevant. Jelly. Just as he to me seems very hairy, I to him must seem very shiny, like a jelly shining on a plate. Bucket. He sits beside me like an old bucket someone's put beside a fire alarm.
Thank you so much. That was great. It's really nice to hear the poems read.
I always think I sound like Maggie Thatcher. You might hear my voice on a like and answer phone message on someone's phone. So I much prefer to be read by someone else. I love to hear them read by someone else because then they don't seem like mine anymore. I always try to disown them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, for me, hearing you read them is perfect because the intonation is all in the right place, it seems to me.
Yes, of course. It's just, as I say, I find it really hard to own them. And also I was thinking I don't like, when you read about people's debut novelists, they always say, oh, I wanted to write the book that I wanted to read myself. And I always think, oh my God, I do not write the books that I want to read. I don't want to read them and I don't want anyone else to read them. So I'm in a muddle about that. I so love my readers, but just as long as they're strangers.
I always kind of trot out this D.W. Winnicott quote, and he said something like, an artist is someone who's caught between the desire to hide and the desire to be out there.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I know that, and it's great. Exactly. And why do we do it? I don't know. I also came across last week Mark Twain, who said the purpose of art is to alleviate shame. I thought that was quite interesting.
Well, I was sort of thinking
It doesn't alleviate shame, by the way, but
it doesn't.
Well, not at all in my case. But someone sent me a thesis they'd written about my work, and it was about shame. So that's what made me pick up on Mark Twain's quote, and I thought that was really interesting. She hadn't interviewed me before she wrote it, but that was just her angle, and I thought it was really interesting that was her angle.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of women poets that I know who are big fans of your work have definitely picked up on that angle. Sophie Collins wrote a book that was published a few years ago called Small White Monkeys, which is about shame in a lot of ways. And she includes a sort of analysis of your poem Prawns de Joe, talking about shame in relation to that. And
oh my God, that's so funny. I mean, of course, I'm totally unaware of it when I'm working. And also, what am I ashamed of?
Well, it seems to be something to do with maybe just the very state of being embodied and kind of experiencing painful emotions, femininity, and what it's like to be an sort of embodied female body in this world.
But why should it be shame? I think that I agree with critics who say it's shame. But as I say, I don't know what I'm ashamed of. But it's hard. It's hard enough being a woman, without having to speak for other women. Talking of feminism, that is. I wouldn't feel I could do that. Julia Copus was wanting to interview me about my Asperger's, which I've never brought up in an interview before, so I'm practicing now and thinking that maybe I certainly am aware of that stigma. So that's a strand, a kind of new strand that I'm coming out with, as it were. It's really hard for me to talk about because it's only recently, as I say, that I've, as it were, come out because I only had my official diagnosis, or I've only told people about my diagnosis since I left working at universities, because universities don't really like it. Although actually that's where, in the groves of academia, where all the autistic people hang out. But when I was at university, I was in the psychiatric hospital for a long time. And when I came out and back home into the real world, it was never to be mentioned. So it's taken me 50 years to realize that I can mention it. It was very strange because, as you can imagine, it was such a traumatic event for me personally, but such a private event, my time in the hospital.
Of course. I mean, I think one thing about your work that is really powerful is that there's a kind of permission giving to other people who've had these experiences or versions of that experience to feel seen, as in the contemporary parlance. And
feel what?
Seen. People are always saying, oh, I feel seen by this, as in...
Oh, seen. I wasn't sure if you said keen or seen.
Oh.
Seen.
Seen,
yes.
S-E-E-N.
But I don't want to be seen.
No, I mean, your readers feel seen,
yes,
as in...
Exactly. That's what's so strange. It's wonderful for my readers to feel seen, and I want them to feel seen, but it's so ironic that I myself find it so difficult.
I don't think you're alone in that as a writer at all. And actually,
the fellowship is a fellowship of the poets and the readers, which is a wonderful fellowship. I suppose that's what we're reaching out to each other as readers and writers. But I find it hard to talk about. Talking of publishing and not publishing, how can I complain when I nevertheless go ahead and publish? So therefore I don't feel I've got a leg to stand on, as it were.
You're very prolific, I would say.
Yes, I am. Never stop. That was another thing. Someone was saying that I recommend to students to cut, and I just wanted to clarify that. And my position is not that I go and say cut, which I think sounds so negative and aggressive and violent and unloving. But what I would say is that my process is to loosen, and then I tighten. So it's rather like loosening your hair. If you've got long hair, I want my work to be as loose as I possibly can and spread it as far as it can and as deep as it can. And then I tighten. So like the work that I've just been reading, each of them has got couplets, 2-line couplets, and they're only, most of them maybe only 4 to 10 lines. But that is reduced by about 8 or 9 times longer or more.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you about your writing process, like say a poem like the first one you read, Standing on His Doorstep. I was rereading that this morning and just marveling at how much I was getting out of it on a whatever it would be, like 20th reading, because I've read them so many.
Oh my God, Emily, shut up.
Well, I mean, as a, not purely as a kind of fan thing, but just in the editing process, one has to.
Yeah, no, I understand, Emily. I understand. I love it that you're out there responding. It's wonderful.
But I was just noticing for the first time the repetition of yellow in the first line, the yellow legs like yellow egg yolks. It's such a beautiful, almost like a tongue twister.
Yes, exactly. Yellow egg yolks is so much the texture of the egg yolks. It's a tongue twister. It's lovely. Yes, sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say that it made me think of that endlessly mentioned poem, the William Carlos Williams, So Much Depends Upon a Red Wheelbarrow, because of the kind of colours. There's just the like really strong primary colours of the poem, because you do have this kind of amazing skill for writing these very short poems, 2 lines sometimes, or 4 in this case. So are you saying that poem has come out of something much bigger and you've...
Yes, I am. And some people might think, well, hang on a minute, if you've been working on it for weeks, how come you've still got 2 yellows and 3 times the word goose? You know.
But it works perfectly.
Dreaming doorstep, doing the D's. I think it's like writing also a very short tune. You would probably sympathise, understand what I'm trying to say, that you get the note, it's the sound and the sense making a note which resonates across the land.
Well, we've just heard from Selima Hill talking to Emily Berry. We'll have a bit of her at the end. I feel as though she's with us tonight, although she's not with us live like Hannah and Stephanie. We're now going to hear from Stephanie reading her second set.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here as well. I think I'm quite interested in secular miracles, just things around us that seem sort of miraculous. So this set is on that theme, hair, sleep and soap. And I'm going to read first of all a poem called Orthopedics and Trauma, King's College Hospital, which is in Tetzerima because the chain rhyme kind of, meshes the whole of society together. And it comes from a rather strange real situation where my daughter was having an operation and a prisoner was brought in with some guards, and they were a very charming couple, one of whom started dancing the receptionist around the waiting room. And there was something touching about the whole thing. At the end, there's something about my father. It reminded me of the young anaesthetist who came to my father and said, don't worry, I'll get you through this, and held his hands. And he was very young. My father was old, and there was this wonderful, touching care between them. Orthopedics and Trauma, King's College Hospital. Waiting, we glimpse the blue alternate world of surgeons in scrubs, wearing the cornflower hue of calm lakes on hot days, slubs of tracked water and boat trails, while the receptionist rubs the arm of the flirty male guard who sways her over the polished floor to his reggae hum. The guard bails out of their rhythm tour to grab his phone at the prisoner's call. He says he'll be free by 4. He's asking for food. He's scared he'll fall. He wants you to know he's been treated well. Later, the prisoner lurches against the wall, arms tense on crutches, and the guards tell him to go steady. He'll be okay. Glass doors glide open to a swell of heat. And here's our daughter in the doorway, with the surgeon who inspected the moon of her patella, the spongy stay of torn cartilage, and the lock of bones. They pack the prisoner in the van. We never know where he goes. Our daughter swings over curbstones. In London parks, afternoon lawns glow like the green scrubs of the young anaesthetist who took my father's hands so long ago. Who took my father's hands so long ago and said, "I'll see you through this." I wish he knew how his green grew over years, 5 fields fed by the rain's promise. And then this poem is called Miracle, and it's a very, very simple poem, but at the same time, it seemed to take me years to write it. I kept getting it out and putting it away again until I had, I suppose, the right amount of prepositional phrases or whatever that seemed to be the right examples of the miracle I wanted. Miracle. In supermarkets strapped in a trolley, on the motorway belted in the back of a car, under the foundered houses, open-mouthed and fed by drips, in a box drilled with holes in the hold of a boat, in fish crates and on cardboard, on pallets and straw, on a bed of needles on the forest floor, in the curve of a rosy scarf tied to a woman's back, in a line of walkers along railway tracks, under our tarpaulin on mud and sand, a child is sleeping, a child is sleeping. And this isn't really miraculous, but it's, this is miraculous, yes. I was thinking of during lockdown, just of things that kind of saved us. And for a long time, I've been researching soap. It's such an interesting substance. It has a whole history and it connects through generations and through cultures, actually. But I never quite found the right moment until the Hands, Face, Space, the government's attempt at a rhyme, came out during the lockdown. So, and I wanted to sing of soap like it was an epic subject, because after all, it saved a lot of lives. For instance, when doctors discovered that washing their hands would save women from dying in childbirth. To sing of soap in desperate times. In spite of palm plantations, felled rainforests and effluents, in spite of plastic dispensers, in spite of nitroglycerine, in spite of a name that categorizes lifelong dramas. To sing of soap is to sing algali, wood ash that lends its name to alkali, to sing rainwater and to sing oils, olive, vegetable, sesame, and not to mourn an absence of tallow, for who wants to rub the fat of a cow on their skin? To sing some soap names, but not others. To sing Pears, Dove, and Lifebuoy, but not Imperial Leather, a name saddled with empire, whose legacy refuses to be washed down the plug hole. To sing of the soap my daughter gave me, nettle and seaweed, astringent shore, field margin, seawater, kelp, ribbon of nori. To sing soap is to sing my grandmother, lathering a slip of palm olive for skin and laundry, and then to sing the green, unrinsed forgetfulness streaking her long white hair. To sing my sister's gift of a bar of soap is to sing a fourth dimension containing the bloom of 2 lavender bushes. To sing soap is to sing a child sifting pink stars through fingers in a bucket of water and soapwort at the Living Museum. To sing soap was to choose on days when the French market still came to town from Les Savons de Marseille, Fenouil, Citron or Muguet des Bois. To sing soap is to sing happy birthday twice, congratulating yourself like a prime minister, or to watch Gloria Gaynor washing her hands, singing, "I will survive" for 20 glorious seconds of being alive. That's the end of my second set.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And now we're going to have a second set from Hannah.
Yeah, just to say, you know, to read with Stephanie and even be in the presence, spiritual or otherwise, of Selima Hill is really wonderful to be, you know, in a tradition of women writing about their lives and experiences. So thank you, Bloodaxe, for bringing us together tonight. The second section of the book is about my kind of experiences in education, formal and informal. And I'll begin with a poem that must have began with me and my mate Nisha at a primary school spitting at each other, but took a rather dark turn. Mrs. Vanuka. On the cold stone floor of the art cupboard, she knelt us down, and her pudgy hands, gold garroted, threw down the buckets. Dirty girls, let's see you spit. The clip clunk of her heels, the door's hard click, and we did. I spat until my mouth was sore and my tongue was fat, while beyond the door we heard her talk and the tick-tock stab of the angry chalk. I'd never known how much my own spit stank. I spat again, until my whole mouth ached. And beside me, Nisha sniffled and sobbed. We couldn't remember which of us first gobbed or what had happened to make us hate each other. And the base of those buckets still barely covered. So I'm sure, you know, like everyone tuning in tonight, there are good teachers and bad teachers in your lives. And, you know, the interesting characters that you encountered at school. I guess as a pair poem, the poem I read earlier, The Only English Kids, I'll read The Only Black Girl, which is about when I went to secondary school. I got to a very multicultural primary school, and then I was sent into deep Essex to a very kind of selective secondary school. And there was only one black girl in my year who was my good friend for a time. The only black girl. The kids flicked names at her like Ludo counters, not just for being black, but for living like I did, the wrong side of the tracks. No £1,000,000 mock Tudors in Forest Gate or Ilford, scrounger, Jew girl, sponger. But Natalie was a fighter, a what do you call me? Poke and puncher. She smacked and shoved her way into a tighter crook, the office, where a gang of teachers caught her. And that was that. Then later, some mother or another saw my dad parked up, and I caught a blow or two. Oi, pick and mixer, white wog. But I had skin the kids forgot, and none of Natalie's fire. There was no wallop or slap in the hands I clenched inside my pockets. Fortunately, I left that school and I went to Barking College, where I encountered the most amazing teachers, totally galvanised my love for literature. The book's dedicated to my old English teacher, John Toolan, now sadly passed away, who taught a very, very radical curriculum. And I'll read the poem in the book that's for him. There's a couple of poems for him, but this one is Pink Hummingbird. The postcard he sent to you that long, wet summer had on one side a pale pink hummingbird, and overleaf his notes on your essay on Faulkner, written in his usual turquoise ink, the words you imagined written in sunlight of the bed of his book-stuffed flat, and each weighed with care, like a love letter, though it was you that wanted him. All summer you waited for September, to be back in the tattered classroom, the tables pushed together, and him at the top, like a doting father or a bridegroom, or like God, if God wore Dr. Martens shoes and a silver sleeper in one ear. Not the God you didn't believe in, but one who believed in you. So at Barking College, I would say that, you know, I met students and teachers that really like, I don't know, I guess I had burgeoning left-wing and anti-racist politics. And that year, 1994, was the year that me and other students from Barking College went on the big demo, the A&L Anti-Nazi League, trying to shut down the BNP bookshop in Plumstead. And it was also the year of the Carnival Against the Nazis, with the picture from the front cover. It is a documentary evidence of. So the poem that I'll read to you now is about that demo. It was shortly after the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and tensions were really, really high. Let me just find the page. and it's called Welling. Bear with me. On the news that night, they called us violent youth. What I remember is the green cord jacket I was wearing, pulled from a bargain bin that morning, and a busload of us singing our way down south. The yellow placard like a bobbing sea of lollipops, a beautiful man with dreadlocks, studs in his chin, and us on the front line marching and chanting until the chanting suddenly stopped. Then one voice shouted, "Police protect the Nazis." The police like a wall of giant flies, their graceful white horses, then silence. No moment in my life do I remember quieter. Before the charges, the bricks, the screams, two boys with gashed heads running together, that animal smell, red smoke, blood on my sleeves. And two more poems I'll read. So I guess like the second section of the book is really about learning in all kinds of ways, in the classroom and outside of the classroom, and, you know, the different people you learn from and the things that you learn. And this one is about my parents and their very heavy smoking. They used to smoke John Player specials, if anyone remembers them, and the black box with the gold embossed writing. Players. My parents taught me smoking. The midnight nip to the Esso garage for 20 players, the kitchen table vigil, lighting one tip from another, then another. No matches or lighter, they bent to the cooker's flame. No credit, no cash. My dad would search the bin to twist tobacco from dog ends, squeeze it, suck it in. Or flush, they'd pile 9, 10 black boxes on the bureau, small coffins in a stack. Stained walls, grey fog, the constant tweezering of fags, that plug between the lips. It took me years to stop, though still some lonely nights I spark one up, and that red night in the darkness leads me back to where they're waiting, holding out the pack. And I'll finish with a poem for my son, Rory. The last section of the book is very much about him. You know, it's about the future and him negotiating London and school and making friends. And I hope he has tuned in to hear this. So hello, Rory. Lovely boy, if you're there. The sky is snowing. The sky is snowing, Rory, and overnight the earth's been eider-downed in feather white. Today is story day, but the schools are shut. And the playground with the rails is a bassinet of silent snow. No burglar Bill will go to school today. No Alice or Gruffalo. On the news, a garter snake of cars has slept the night below the frozen stars. The sky is snowing, love, in pale marshmallows and flecks of mint. You're at the kitchen window in your burglar stripes and mask and bag of swag, my little crooked scallywag. Let's lift the window just a slip and catch this snowstorm on your fingertip. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. We're about to hear again from Selima Hill, who's reading and talking about her new book, Men Who Feed Pigeons. She said that the title related to Ohima I can't pronounce it, Hrabal, the Czech writer who fell to his death while apparently feeding pigeons. He actually fell from a 5th floor hospital window, which puts a bit of a different reflection on it, as you'll certainly get those other emanations from the next part of the interview with Selima. She's going to be reading from 3 sections from the book. When we reach the reading of the poems, the first poem will be from the beautiful man with the unpronounceable name, which you've heard a bit from in the first section. And then she'll be reading from Biro, about living next door to a mysterious uncle with a dog. And the other poems she's reading are from Ornamental Lakes, seen from trains, about a woman and a man she's afraid of. The sequences we've got by Selima are a little longer than those by Hannah and Stephanie, because we'll be hearing Hannah and Stephanie talking at the end. And if you do have any further comments or questions you want to make, do put them into the chat and we'll pick up on them after Selima has had a further little chat here with Emily Berry and read some more poems.
Would say, going back to the goose, I wanted to ask you about animals, because animals appear so much in your work and with great kind of tenderness and empathy, but they're often associated with, I guess, sort of states of abjection or sort of uncomfortable states in some way. I just, I wondered what that's all about. Are you a big animal lover? How do sort of animals come into your life?
Nice one. Maybe it's a way of follow on from what you're saying about being embodied. Maybe it's a way of talking about bodies without talking about other men and women. And looking back to my childhood, I was brought up some of the time on a farm, and I used to sit in the tractor cabin, is it called a cabin, on the tractor with the farmer, and he was the man who I trusted, the only man I loved and I trusted, and a different kind of man from the men in my life. And I used to spend all day perched up behind him with his dog and his cows. I suppose that was the best memories of my childhood, so maybe it was to do with that. I felt very, very safe.
And I guess being on farms at an early age, you would have had a lot of contact with animals in kind of both joyous and sort of disturbing forms.
Exactly. You're so right. Exactly. So you could hear them also being taken away in lorries and mooing and sad things. And I could never quite understand how the farmer could do that. That puzzled me, because you could hear them mooing and they sounded so sad when the calves were separated. But also, what I didn't know at the time, there was a fire at that farm where I was burnt as a child, and he was feeding the cattle, and he rescued me from the upstairs window. He threw a ladder against the door and pulled me out of my burning cot. So it was him that saved my life, but I didn't know until later. So he and I had a really special bond, which is nice. My family didn't have animals, and all my life I used to think, how can adults not want a dog? And when I grow up, that's the first thing I'm going to do, and it was.
I want to go back a bit to you talking about writing being like drawing. I'm interested in this kind of link to art and you having grown up in a family of artists, because I feel like your writing is quite painterly. The sort of short poems with these strong images sometimes feel like still lifes, like the jelly shining on its plate, or just the old bucket sitting beside a fire alarm, like
Can
a sort
I
of...
just say, Emily, that when you say painterly and visual and images, I would like to nudge that a little bit towards thinking of it more as sensory.
I can
So
see
like
that.
the jelly would be the colour of the jelly, but you also see the texture.
Definitely.
And the smell, as well as the abstract thing of celebratory and childhood.
Perhaps then what I was thinking of rather than still lives is more like sculpture, because
That's better.
I can actually see the physicality of the bucket.
That's better, yeah.
And as we were sort of talking about at the beginning, the kind of embodiedness is quite a big thing in your work.
And it sounds rather pompous, but the thing that I can get closest to as a description is like bearing witness. And bearing witness always sounds as if you're witnessing something rather terrible or rather dramatic. But I would like to think we could bear witness to the tiniest thing.
Absolutely.
But I don't know if you know the writer Jenny Diskey.
Yeah.
Did you know that Jenny Diskey was also in the hospital? So Jenny and I were in the hospital together, and it was so moving.
Oh, wow.
We were together.
Did you meet there, or you knew each other before?
No, we didn't. But the Maudsley Hospital had a very elite kind of ward, and we had, looking back on it, rather experimental treatments, because it was like in the 60s. She was Doris Lessing's adopted daughter, and so I suppose Doris Lessing knew how to get her to the best place, and my family also knew. So I think that's how come we were both there. And there was about one or two other people who were kind of well known subsequently who were there being experimented on. Yeah, and I was mute. Don't know if you know that, but I didn't talk. So Jenny was my spokesperson as well as everything else. Looking back on it, it's so moving, really. It was traumatic in the extreme, but amazing that Jenny was there. For instance, once I had a toothache, and do you mind my talking like this?
No, please.
It's so nice to talk to you. I feel that you're so understanding. And I haven't told anyone, now Jenny's gone, but I had this toothache and I was tactilely very defensive. Like, I didn't used to go to the canteen in the hospital to eat. I was always alone because I didn't like to be touched. I had to go to the dentist. So they strapped me in a wheelchair because I was just had a panic attack and would be hysterical if somebody touched me. And also I didn't talk, of course. So I remember Jenny coming with me, and I was strapped in the wheelchair, and we went in the lift from the Maudsley Hospital across the road to the King's College Hospital, which was just across the road. And Jenny was with me, so that was such a nice memory. Because we were, sections, so we weren't allowed out. So Jenny and I were allowed out, and we had a nurse each, and we crossed Denmark Hill to the hospital together. This is irrelevant, but it's a happy memory.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a sort of quite a key piece of literary history somehow.
What kind of a woman am I? What kind of a woman am I not to speak? Not to say a word, to be struck dumb, to back away like a newborn toothpick that hasn't learnt to pick what it must pick. Chickens. Even when he's kind, I feel like chicken shit, shat by chickens out the heading worms. And when he isn't, like the headless worm. You either love a person or you don't. I step onto his shoes and cling on tight, my face between his knees, but the man shakes me off and kicks me in the head. I'm 3 years old. The man is my father. You either love a person or you don't. That's what I've been told, but it's not true. My horse hoof soup. His face is thin and grey like the soup that shudders at the sound of galloping horsemen. His throat is like the pines where the birds, flocks of tiny birds you can't see, are stabbing at the panic-stricken beetles. I try to take a sip, but it's impossible. Berries. Hello, Emily. Berries. Berries. His touch is like the touch of a bandage, soft but slightly sinister. All berries. And being touched makes her feel good, the way it feels good to feel helpless. The tank. He peers at me as if I'm in a tank. He marvels at my ugliness and stupor. I can be as ugly as I like. Better to be ugly than afraid. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, now that we've heard from Selima, we're going to bring our live guests together, Hannah and Stephanie. Thank you all for listening and watching. It's been a very wonderful event. So, in Selima's discussion now with Emily Berry, they were talking about animals as a way of figuring what she was writing about. And I know both of you have been involved in aspects of fiction, story writing. In Selima's case, in her early books, she had the problems that she went through, the mental problems that she went through, were partly the result of abuse that she suffered growing up. And in the early books, there was a lodger in the book who was the protagonist, the guilty party. But in the later books, it was clear that it was a family member. But the later books, she was unable to publish those poems or write those poems even because those people were still alive. I know in your case, Hannah, you're writing about real people, but you also are fictionalizing them. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit about that process of how you deal with, and also followed by Stephanie with talking about Helen Dunmore, how you actually address those issues of writing about real people or writing about them in other ways, as Selima Hill does. Starting with Hannah.
Yeah, sure. Well, particularly in this book, I guess the issues of ethics were really key, and I was thinking them through as I was writing the poems. But you know, the poems are heavily fictionalized, which was almost not an unconscious process, but just the very act of writing a sonnet, trying to rhyme, trying to write metrically, means that you shift away from the documentary truth. And if I think about most of the poems in the book, certainly the ones about my experiences of teaching, the students in the poems, they're not quite real. They're kind of conflations of maybe a number of students that I had over the years, or some of the encounters I mentioned were things that happen time and time again. But for the purpose of the poem, I would kind of create a student and give them a name. None of the names are real, to kind of carry the energy or the narrative over. I guess I've always felt with, ethics, because mostly my writing is about my family, right, and particularly about my dad. And I always had this sense that my dad would give me permission to write about him, I think, probably. But when you're writing about other people, you need to be much, much more cautious. So those are the sort of strategies I was using: anonymizing and fictionalizing, conflation, and those sorts of things. I think the other thing about, not so much in this book, but in other books when I've written about, like, distant family in Jamaica or China, is that you've got to do your research, because I think that makes the work hold up if you've really, really delved into finding out as much as you can before you make a kind of representation. So yeah, that's my kind of thinking about the ethical stuff, but Stephanie may have some other thoughts.
No, I think that's really interesting, Hannah. I did love your collection so much, and the way you dealt with teaching. It was really deep and fantastic. And the sonnet form took us through it in so many ways. I'd love to talk about that more with you. It was so powerful to me as someone who's taught a lot as well. I was really there with you in the classroom. I think writing about Helen, Helen was a very private person, and we had quite an intimate friendship. So one of my considerations in writing the poems was not really to reveal personal things about Helen, because I knew that she wouldn't like it. And I knew, and her family, who I'm friends with too, perhaps wouldn't. So I think what I was writing about, it made me think about what an elegy is. Are you writing about your own grief, or are you writing directly to memorialize a person? And in a way, I tried to memorialize the conversation more, almost in a slightly abstract way. All the poems about Helen are about sort of speaking with her. That was our contact. That was our big thing, to talk together quite intensively over many years. And I don't think you learn that much about Helen herself from the poems. And I might have others where you do, but I won't publish those, if you see what I mean. And it was really interesting that you said your dad would give you permission, because I've written a lot of tender poems about my father, but he absolutely blasted me for writing poetry, and it was awful. So, but I still do it. So I didn't really have permission. So that's made me rather cautious about how I write. And sometimes I'm a bit mysterious, I think, because I need to write about things, but I don't want to come out with them exactly, because I've had all this trouble over it.
Well, I think that's the difference when someone is alive to say, no, don't do that, and when someone is dead and you can make the conjecture that they want in mind. I suppose in the end, and this may sound rather kind of cutthroat, but I felt that my dad's life, he was such a kind of marginalized person, and I felt that his story, which is a story of real struggle and survival, it needed to be told, not least because it was part of a kind of the legacy of other social and political forces, to do with the empire. It was illustrative of that whole period of like post-war Caribbean migration. But so I kind of felt like it was a story that needed to be told politically. But I do out him as maybe, being a gambler and, being involved with small-time criminality. And yeah, I can't know, but I think that is the difference. When someone's not here, you can make those decisions, as complicated as they may be.
In the interview with Selima, Emily talks about being seen, and in a way, you enable your father to be seen, don't you, as a human being, and in terms of his life.
Yeah, and I felt that, you know, my dad, had he not grown up under the particular circumstances that he had, you know, he might, well, he loved poetry, he might have been a poet, and he was a brilliant, you know, one of the things that he got from all that card sharking was he was a brilliant mathematician, and he was very political. You know, he could have been a politician, but it just, that wasn't, those things weren't available to him. So I guess I made another kind of fame or infamy available to him. But it was really interesting hearing you talk, Stephanie, about who grief, you know, about elegies and what they are, you know, who has the right to write about someone's life, who owns grief, right? Because it feels when you're grief stricken, it's very much yours, but of course it's also about someone else. So finding those ways of doing it, those strategies of obscuring or hiding, I think that's really interesting. I mean, it's not something that I have done. I've laid my cards on the table, but I'm so interested.
One thing I loved about yours, Anna, was I love the moments where you managed to make within the sonnet something that you can't see, because I was thinking that's a bit like grief and you, a different thing. Something that you can't see, you make it sort of actual. Like when in one of the sonnets, you, as a teacher, you go out of the room. When you come back, you can sense like all the naughty talk and things that's gone on, and it's kind of hanging in the room invisibly. And somehow, with a sonnet, you give it life. So it's like giving something almost slightly abstract. This life, this existence within the classroom or the sonnet shape you were talking about.
Yeah, I guess the sonnet holds so much. Is that, you know, I think everyone knows that feeling where maybe like you've left the room and you come in and you realize your friends have been talking about you or something like that. It's a very familiar, the fizz in the air of what's gone on. And that's where, you know, it's about how much what can language capture, isn't it? Because there's other things that language can't capture. That's where maybe poetry falls down sometimes. And I wonder if you felt that poetry can't always capture experience, feeling, emotion, because it seems to me in your poems you really are trying to pin down feelings, thoughts, but I wonder if you felt poetry can always be a vehicle for that.
Yeah, I suppose that's where you work really with metaphors or finding, I think for me often I look out to the landscape and I use the landscape as a sort of emotional language, and you know, one worry might be, is that clear to other people, or does my thinking in sort of landscape images convey that emotion? It's true, it's hard when you're just about to kind of want to nail something to sort of look away slightly and convey it in a different way. Yeah,
and especially when someone said to me about metaphor that it works best when it's completely surprising and absolutely precise. And I thought, my God, what have we set ourselves up for, poets? You know, like how many more metaphors are there in the world? You know, have we exhausted all of them? To find that balance between the surprise and the precision. Yeah.
Well, that's where Selima's work would come in, because it's really surprising all the time. And metaphors and similes are so incredibly surprising. And I thought I just picked out one I really loved, which was about animals too. Perhaps I'll read it, but it said very short, because she said she didn't mind other people reading her work out. So this is called the Eerie Llama. I just thought it was so good. The Eerie Llama, like the long-legged man inside my head, the long-legged ghost who's unpredictable in everything except his pertinacity, the Eerie Llama glides along his fence. She finds these surreal metaphors and similes that really, that you know, it feels like it's so rich to have written all these books and to have created this way of expressing emotion, which is almost sort of tangential somehow and shocks you.
Also, her poems are very humorous, but they're very dark at the same time, aren't they? And that's a very unusual combination.
Yeah,
they made me laugh all the time. I was laughing but being shocked at the same time.
They're kind of heartbreaking. I was going to find the one that I really, I need my glasses. I wish I'd had my glasses when I was a teacher. I might have had more authority. So I was going to read the one that I think it's not doing so much with metaphor, but it is absolute brevity that conveys humour and heartache at the same time. It's the poem The Sea. And it just says, he's sitting with his back to the sea, facing the car park in a bobble hat. I myself am facing the sea. I thought the sea was the whole point. The whole world there of her thinking that it's some great romance. They're going to go and stare at the sea together. And this rather disappointing bloke in a bobble hat is staring at the car park. She's like, why am I here? You know? But yeah, that kind of economy in writing is so admirable, I think.
But Hannah, when you got into writing the sonnets, did the sonnet form, because I get quite obsessed when I'm writing things like sonnets, did it keep like going through your head, or how long did it take? I mean, it's such a huge enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the whole burden of what a sonnet is and all the amazing sonneteers through the ages.
Yeah.
So that was really on my mind. But, you know, I tried to write this book, I don't know if I mentioned this, as an extended crown, where each of the last lines would be the beginning of the next poem, and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't pull it off.
Really hard,
so formally tricky, you know, to write over 50 poems like that. But by the time I've been doing that, I was so deep into the sonnet, to the rhyme scheme, and I was seeing all the time. I was seeing surprising words that I'd be thinking, oh, that rhymes with that. You know, I must take that home, put it in the notebook. And you know, after, you know, it took me maybe 4 years to write this, but now I'm like, I can't write poems at the minute because I've just got the sonnet in my head, and all I can write is sonnets. I've got to shake it off, and then probably I'll choose a new form. But in your book, I was admiring your use of form as well, and I wondered if you wanted to say anything about what form does for you. I just thought we're in an age now where lots of poets are kind of throwing off the form. They see it as being, you know, constraining. I find it the opposite, and I wonder what you thought of, you know.
Well, in most of my other books, I had quite a few sonnets, and I had a crown sort of sequence in the first one, but in this one, I think I'm actually looser, and I've done some prose poems as well, and I found those were good for, I think I have a lot of internal rhyme in them and rhythms, so that they're not just prosy, hopefully. But I found they were good for lockdown, actually, because somehow I suppose they're more expansive and you can look at things in a different way. And although I read them aloud a lot to make sure they had sound, they weren't really formal poems, but they kind of allowed me to go to a slightly different place. So I think changing form allows for a transformation of subject matter somehow. And otherwise, I don't have many really formal poems in the book, but the Terzarima one, I did really think I wanted that plain rhyme for the orthopedics and trauma poem.
I love it.
Because I felt we were all meshed together. The prisoner was actually wearing chains, which was rather odd to see someone going in for an operation like that. I couldn't quite get that in the poem, so it's more through sound, I suppose.
Maybe that's the whole thing, you know, that form should match up with content, and, you know, the idea of lockdown with all its expansiveness of time was in some ways very constraining, in other ways kind of like totally endless and freeing. I guess those kind of personally, I find free verse harder to write because it's got no rules, you know, and it's still got to have music and I'm like, oh, that's like just being cast into the Pacific Ocean. I want a nice small swimming pool with balls and rules, no diving, you know.
I like the way you use the sonnet really emotionally, because you had like the Volta. In one you talk about there was no Volta for these kids. There was no change for them, just at the point where the Volta comes in a sonnet. And I love the way you actually use the form to reflect kind of emotionally and psychologically on where the kids were or where the mood of that afternoon in the classroom was. I thought that was really clever and I so enjoyed it. And another thing I loved was you were varied the sonnet form, and you had like the 7/7 poem, which actually instead of having 5 beats to the line had 7 beats in couplets. So it really was 7/7, and it really reflected the horror, you know, of that day, and it disrupted the neatness of the sonnet form. So it does kind of explode in its 7/7 beat. And then the following poem, you've missed out a line. It's the only one that's 13 lines. Someone's been killed and someone's been taken out. And I found that use of form really reflecting meaning was terribly powerful. You know, I was really moved by it, and I was cut short by that missing line.
think I was reading Jeff Hilson's book, The Reality Book of Sonnets, where it's ostensibly an anthology of sonnets, but you've got sonnet writers doing literally breaking every rule of the sonnet, the 13-line sonnet, and the sonnet with 6 beats or 3 beats, or the one word per line sonnet. And I suppose I guess it reflects back on that whole idea about tradition, is that when young writers say, no, that's just traditional, that's male, that's archaic, I always think, well, take it and renew it, do something different, and then then it's yours, you've made it yours, and then you stand in the tradition, but you're an innovator. Not that I'm claiming massive innovation in this book, but I do love it when people take form and throw it apart.
Yeah, no, I love some of your half sonnets too, like Elizabeth Bishop's Spirit Level, which is half lines, and I think you had that in a couple, like Technology and the sonnet for the A-level syllabus. I thought, who else has written a sonnet for a syllabus? That's really original.
Why would you do that? I love in your book that you've got a poem about teaching as well, your poem about night teaching. Yeah, and the kind of the cleaner trying to clean you out, trying to sweep you out of the room.
Yes, it's really, it's sometimes you just feel nobody really wants you to actually teach. That's the thing. Yeah.
Or is that a question that's popped up in the chat?
Oh, a question finally. We've had lots and lots of comments, lots of really appreciative comments. Now we do have a question from Dino Mahoney. Hannah, how did the kids you taught respond to poetry? Which poems, poets, if any, did they like? Did they get poetry and page versus performance?
I always tell this anecdote, and it's not actually true, that I had to teach an anthology of 1,000 years of English poetry. So everything from the Anglo-Saxons right up to the modern day. And I remember trying so hard to enthuse the students about poetry that I kind of felt the only person I enthused was myself, because that's when I started writing. In combination with reading contemporary poetry, I was reading Neil's anthology Staying Alive, but I was reading, all these God's Grandeur and, Gerard Manley Hopkins, are just falling in love with poetry. But the students liked poetry once you threw off the idea that poetry is meant to be difficult, and I think that's one of the problems with the way poetry can be taught, or perhaps sometimes the way the curriculum encouraged it to be taught was almost like by numbers. You can break it down, and this is a metaphor, and this is this is the rhyme scheme, and if you could put all those chunks together and put them in an essay, then you would crack the poem. And actually what I tried to do is to get them to feel the poem first. And when that happened, I don't think I write enough about the really brilliant moments in the classroom that happened that I don't attribute to me, but to the students I was teaching. So it was a mixed bag, Dino, I would say. And as a teacher, I'm sure you're familiar with that. Yeah. But poetry shouldn't be difficult. That's why I really strongly feel that poetry shouldn't be hard. It shouldn't be made hard so that people feel reluctance about it from an early age. That's a real problem. We're born into, we grow up in rhyme, we grow up in songs and nursery rhymes, and we lose it at school. It's not the fault of teachers. I hate teacher bashing, but something happens at school sometime that, where poetry becomes hard.
Yeah. Actually, something has happened tonight. We have this thing with our Bloodaxe launch events where I send copies of the poets' books to each other so they get to read each other before the event. And I do encourage you to talk to each other. But tonight we've had, in the words of Stephanie's title, a real conversation between the two of you. And it's been great to sit back and just listen to the two of you. And I'd like to finish the event by thanking again Emily Berry and the Poetry Society for letting us use that wonderful podcast of Selima, which is great to have. I'd like to thank also Pete Hebden from NCLA for doing such a great job on all the audio-visual side tonight. Thank everyone for coming. Encourage you to scroll down the YouTube page where you'll find links to the books, and do order the books. It'd be great for you to be getting hold of the books as soon as you can. And I'd also like to say that on Tuesday, the 19th of October, we're having our next event, which is launching new books by Claire Askew, Anne-Marie Austin, and George Surtees. So thank you very much, everyone, for watching tonight. And thank you very much, Hannah and Stephanie, for your great readings and great conversation.
Thanks, Neil. Thank you so much.
Lots of love to everyone.
Yeah.